In Hogarth's To Cruikshank, Social Change in Graphic Satire, Dorothy George noted that in any view of 18th century London, there should be a tavern scene. With this statement, she attests to the proliferation of drinking establishments in the city. Indeed, throughout the long 18th century, printmakers and publishers served an enthusiastic clientele for humorous scenes of inebriation set in the clubs, taverns, and streets of London. And I will only be able to share a handful of the many, many prints. But I, again, refer you to the Wellcome Trust, the Lewis Walpole Library, the British Museum, and other sites that have hundreds of these prints available for digitized. These images vary from comic to amoral to highly serious. This presentation poses questions in looking at these prints. Just how humorous were representations of alcohol intoxication? In what ways might such humor be interpreted? How do divergent imaginings by printmakers reflect contemporary understandings of drunkenness? And I will begin with comic images that inspire laughter, and then consider the transformations of these allegedly comic types to more overtly reforming narratives. And perhaps sometimes they are both at once. There are, of course, many varieties of laughing. Laughing with someone, laughing at someone or something, laughing derisively, or anxious laughing as a means of coping with terrible circumstances or events. On the screen is William Hogarth's A Midnight Modern Conversation, published in 1733. In City of Laughter, Vic Cottrell designates this scene as the grandfather of all debauchery prints, apart from the 17th century Dutch prints, which British types directly descend. Hogarth's print is indeed a canonical characterization of drunken revelry among club members in 18th century London, one which helped establish Hogarth's popularity. The chaotic, dizzying scene is set in a well-furnished clubroom said to be St. John's Coffee House at Temple Bar. A company of 11 men gather around a circular table. They share libations from a large punch bowl. Punch was the drink of choice for middling classes. The men display various stages and types of drunkenness, from stupefied to singing, from falling into slumber to falling prostrate on the floor in an impossibly contorted pose in the foreground. The midnight hour of the title, corroborated by the clock on the wall reading 4 a.m., the candles burned down to almost nothing, the dawning light reflected in an empty bottle, all lead us to understand the scene represents the descent of a political debate into long hours of drunken revelry. By serendipity, I found insight into the inherent power of Hogarth's drunken scene to inspire laughter in R.J. Moehringer's New York Times bestseller, The Tender Bar, published in 2005. This autobiographical coming-of-age story centers on a Long Island pub, the excessive drinking there, and the author's lifelong affection for the place and its regulars. The author therein describes his laughing response to a midnight conversation when he was an undergraduate. And he writes, "Often I'd spend the whole day in one of Yale's museums, especially the Center for British Art. I'd sit for long stretches in front of an 18th century Hogarth, A Midnight Modern Conversation, which showed a table in an alehouse and dozens of drinkers laughing and pirouetting and falling to the floor. The painting sometimes made me laugh out loud, and it always made me homesick." So is this laughing one of affectionate familiarity, reminiscent comfort, or discomfort? There is some historical evidence that Hogarth's contemporaries and successors repurchased the imagery in ways that suggest that they too found its appealing laughter. So on the screen now is the painting at Yale, which Moehringer describes. It is an early copy of Hogarth's composition, the original painting being lost. This one has been expanded horizontally, probably to accommodate an overmantel for use as a tavern decor or promotion of the activities, celebration of the activities within. As such, it is one of many innumerable reissues, copies, piracies, and appropriations of Hogarth's masterpiece. The Bacchanalians, or a poem addressed to the ingenious Mr. Hogarth, is another copy in reverse with added text expounding the pleasures and excesses of Hogarth's A Midnight Modern Conversation. It is from this print, as well as another illustrating a song sheet for the Jolly Bacchanalians, which I have borrowed the liberty-taking title of my talk in order to emphasize the celebratory aspect of Hogarth's depiction of wanton drunkenness as a canonical representation of convivial, inebriated male society. The bemusement audiences felt for Hogarth's scene even prompted appropriations of the composition for effective advertisement. On the screen, I show you Freeman's tobacco card, while noting that a Freeman's tobacco wrapper lies on the table in A Midnight Modern Conversation. And Richard Lee's tobacco shop trade card also used Hogarth's composition. Both are modified copies of Hogarth's picture, and tobacco and drink, then as now, were closely linked indulgences. On the other hand, as Jenny Uglo observes, Hogarth traded on the sting of his art and practice of ridiculing the very classes who should provide his patrons: magistrates, merchants, gentry, and clerics. These are the middle-aged men, befuddled topers who gather around the tavern table. Contemporaries quickly identified persons in defiance of the caption on Hogarth's print, which advised viewers, think not one to find one meant resemblance there. We lash the vices, but the persons spare. Prints should be prized as authors should be read, who sharply smile prevailing folly dead. Ugo notes that men about town delighted in caricature and catcalling and seeing eminent people at a disadvantage. A Midnight Modern Conversation, appealing to the taste for ridiculing laughter. I emphasize here Hogarth's conviction in the power of a smile to reveal and perhaps to censor. Heirs to the comic Hogarth abound. H.W. Benbury's A Long Story and G.M. Woodward's The Progress of Drunkenness each caricature the different states of inebriation. Such light-hearted treatments of convivial drunkenness were collected in albums by fashionable gentlemen and viewed for social entertainment. Horace Walpole, for example, assembled prints by the amateur Bunbury, whom he dubbed a second Hogarth, for amusing entertainment to be shared with his friends. For those not able to afford their own collection of caricatures and satires, folios were available to rent for an evening entertainment, as announced in the lower margin of Woodward's image by the publisher S.W. Force. Drunken Tavern Scenes by Thomas Rowlandson further nuanced the laughing legacy of Hogarth's model, now even more boisterous, and here with vomiting added. Rowlandson himself spent much time in Covent Garden and frequented the tavern club known there as the Brilliants, which was patronized by convivial theater and print men. Vic Cottrell, whose London scholarship embraces a bawdry masculine construction of 18th century London, characterizes the image as one that didn't so much criticize as celebrate the manic drinking that proved manly vigor in that booze-soddened age. If Cottrell's Rowlandson manifests a jaunty indifference to convivial moralizing, Amelia Rouser describes Rowlandson's bemused attachment that eschews tidy moral lessons or clear political arguments as amoral, in that it fails to tell us how to feel and lends his work a distinctive combination of gaiety, hedonism, and superficiality. Or, Rouser alternatively suggests, perhaps it was a sense of humility that drove Rowlandson's ironic distance and dispassion in the bemusement of observing the folly of others. Having introduced some complexities of humor in these representations of drunkenness, I return to Hogarth, but now in order to consider another Hogarth, one who smiled and laughed less, one who was a dedicated reformer of social reform, of social ills, an activist committed to change through the instruments of law and institutions, and one who understood the power of images to critique and even reform London society. If perceived by some as comic, Hogarth's prints were also invariably serious comedy, as the subtitle of David Byman's Hogarth's Life and Times indicates. Hogarth scholar Ronald Paulson offers a similar assessment in a sardonic letter written to decline an invitation to speak on comedy in Hogarth from a humor and irony group at the Arizona State University. After characterizing himself as someone who is about as unfunny as a person can be, Paulson continued with a resounding dismissal of Hogarth as funny. He writes, "I think there may be a sense in which one laughs with the wit of Hogarth's prints, but they are hardly humorous. They are usually rather horrible. Maybe irony catches them, but I have also known children who had nightmares after looking at Hogarth engravings." If, in fact, we pair the humor and wit of satirists like Hogarth, Rowlandson, and Bunbury alongside Hogarth as the activist who deployed his prints in service of reform. On the screen are two club scenes from Hogarth's A Rake's Progress, published in 1735, the second of the artist's progresses. Defined in Hogarthian terms, a progress is a sequential narrative of the life of a ne'er-do-well individual and their ultimate ruin as a result of ill-advised actions. The progresses are at once humorous, moralistic, perhaps instructional, or alternatively deterministic. In a series of 8 scenes, A Rake's Progress illustrates the tale of Tom Rakerell, the spendthrift son who uses the wealth inherited from a miserly father to ape rakish aristocracy. In successive episodes, the son leads a wasteful life, including carousing, drinking, and gambling. Ultimately, he descends into poverty, ending his days in debtor's prison and finally in a madhouse for paupers. Plate 3 on the left shows a drunken Tom cavorting in a tavern with lowly thieves and prostitutes who cheat and rob him. The disarray of the room, with everything broken and overturned, reflects the state of his life. He has evidently been in a street brawl, his sword thrust through his belt recently drawn against a watchman whose battered lantern and staff lie at his feet. The scene of plate 6 is a London gambling house. At the center, the disheveled, wigless Tom has knocked over his chair and fallen to his knees, frantic for having lost a second fortune gained in marriage to an elderly old maid. The dog pictured in plate 6 wears a collar that reads Covent Garden, implying, as Paulson has pointed out, that the gambling house is probably located there. Hogarth kept a shop at Covent Garden from 1729 to 1733, around the time he published A Rake's Progress. And for years, Hogarth was a member of the Beefsteaks Club located in Covent Garden. The setting of the narrative of the rake in a space personally familiar inflects it with knowing understanding. Enhancing associations of the debauchery of the rake, now called the Ramble, with bawdry reputation of Covent Garden, an anonymous pirated version of Rake's Progress includes an episode entitled "He and His Drunken Companions Raise a Riot in Covent Garden." This print reimagines the interior scene of Hogarth plate 6 as a raucous street row in Covent Garden Piazza. The location is clearly identified by the colonnade of the market and Indigo Jones St. Paul's Church. The print then makes explicit the fight alluded to in Hogarth's plate 3 as an unruly drunkenness spills onto the London streets. With the publication of Beer Street and Gin Lane, Hogarth himself returned to scenes of street drunkenness and overtly addressed the problem of lower class vices. These prints were offered at deliberately lower price. Even the shift of his usual graphic style of refined etching and engraving evident in his progresses turned to a simplified execution recalling the popular media of woodcut and signals a new reform-oriented direction in his response to increase in London street crime from drunkenness. Hogarth's Beer Street and Gin Lane coincided with the publication of a pamphlet in 1751 by his friend the magistrate Henry Fielding, titled An Inquiry into the Causes of the Late Increase of Robbers. Section 2 was on drunkenness and describes the consumption of gin, which intoxicated more quickly and severely and could be acquired for less money. Gin also was foreign and newly available in England, and also problematically a big revenue source for proprietors of gin shops. Hogarth's autobiographical notes outlined his reforming purpose. Beer Street and Gin Lane were done, he writes, when the dreadful consequences of gin drinking was at its height. In Gin Lane, every circumstance of its horrid effects are brought to view. Nothing but idleness, poverty, misery, and ruin are to be seen. Distress, even to madness and death, and not a house intolerable condition, but the pawnbrokers and the gin shop. Beer Street, its companion, was given as a contrast, where the invigorating liquor is recommended in order to drive the other out of vogue. Here, all is joyous and thriving. Industry and jollity go hand in hand. The pawnbroker in this happy place is the only house going to ruin. As Uglo notes, Hogarth's prints offered positive and negative messages to the lower class of people, the city as a jolly comic romp in Beer Street, and the city as a ravaged desert in Gin Lane. The order is important, Uglo insists. Beer Street comes first because the affectionately drawn scene is the accepted satire of the city, so that when people turn to Gin Lane, the shock would be doubled. In Beer Street, happy workers and well-fed Englishmen fueled by large mugs of beer fill a prosperous setting. Gin Lane is the scene of the misery and despair of poverty and addiction in a crumbling environment. A drunken mother drops her infant to certain death. A blind ballad singer dying of starvation reclines near her feet in the foreground. Hogarth knowingly aimed these images not just to the lower classes, but perhaps even more pointedly to those who were able to effect change, magistrates, policing authorities, and policymakers. And the Gin Act passed in 1751, attempting to curtail the evil by reducing the number of gin shops, doubling taxes, and increasing police authority. Hogarth's enormous commercial and aesthetic success inspired a broad spectrum of legacy progresses across subsequent generations of printmakers. Some appropriated the format for the charge of reform. C.J. Grant produced wonderful down-market, often radical political satires in the cheaper media of woodcut and lithography, thereby reaching wider, less wealthy audiences. In A Drunkard's Progress on the Screen, Grant adapted the sequential Hogarthian moral tale to a single plate narrative. A snaking curve through the street follows the inevitable trajectory of gin drinking from the pawn shop in the left foreground to the gin shop, from thence to the workhouse and the gaol, and ultimately to the scaffold, as the caption below outlines. The bottle, the more famous satirist George Cruikshank would later conceive as a full-blown Hogarthian progress as temperance propaganda. There is no contrast, as in Beer Street and Gin Lane, just the sure destruction of one family by the introduction of alcohol. This dystopian progress series erases any trace of Hogarthian wit and humor for the dour zeal of temperance, but it is not without sympathy. It initiated when in 1846, Joseph Adshede of Manchester, reformer and writer, proposed to Hogarth that he design a series of plates illustrating the dire effects of drinking. And we should note here that Cruikshank himself was noted for his rather debaucherous life before this point. The bottle in 8 plates was published by David Bogue in 1847. It was produced as a glyphograph, a mid-century mechanized innovation for type and relief printing by electrolysis and steam press. A sacrifice of image quality was compensated by the opportunity for mass circulation that would enable the message of temperance to reach tens of thousands at a low price within the reach of working classes. The series begins with a husband inducing his wife to take just one drop for the first time. After a series of unfortunate events, the husband job loss, the pawning of clothes to supply the bottle, the family driven by poverty into the street, the death of the youngest child, quarrels and violence, all consoled by the bottle, and the murder of the wife in drunkenness by the father. The tale ends with the manic father imprisoned. The bottle, the caption concludes, has done its work. Plate 1 and 8, a companion to the bottle known as The Drunkard's Children was published in 1849 and is, to my mind, a more compelling pictorial narrative. This progress follows the ill-fated destiny of the children of an addicted father, which ends with the suicidal death of the daughter. In the last scene, her body floats in suspended motion as she has just thrown herself from a bridge. In conclusion, there is much variety in the graphic imagery of Intoxication as there is variety in humor, laughing, and despair that it elicits. The words of Uglo, the black image of Gin Lane almost overpowers as it racked the scene of dissolution, still imprints itself indelibly on the mind. I conclude with the political cartoonist Mark Rosen's Cocaine Lane, inscribed after Hogarth in the upper left. His obvious appropriation of the Hogarthian dystopia, now updated as a gut-wrenching scene of the ravages of the cocaine epidemic in London. But we laugh at the recognition of Hogarth's imagery translated to the 21st century, wherein the intoxicated mother and child of Gin Lane are now portrayed with the large clenched teeth symptomatic of cocaine jitters. The dog shares a snort of gin, with the Gin Lane ballad singer now turned addict with a straw stuck in his nose. There is humor that perhaps alleviates despair here. Hogarth, in Ralston's assessment, is at once funny and very dark. Thank you.